Has you ever paused to think about how we try to measure something as incredibly personal and, well, subjective as your overall health? We often rely on those simple scales, right? Rating your pain from 0 to 10, or maybe your mood on a kind of sliding thermometer thing. But what if those seemingly straightforward tools have a surprising secret history and are still, grappling with some truly fascinating unresolved questions about what they're really measuring? Today's deep dive is into precisely one of those tools, the EQ VAS, or EuroQol Visual Analogue Scale. It's a real workhorse in health research and clinical settings, and honestly, it's very likely something you've used yourself, even if you didn't know its official name. Our mission today, and we're guided by a recent pretty insightful review paper, is to unpack the truly unexpected origin of the EQ VAS. We'll also delve into the current understanding, or maybe more accurately, the striking lack of understanding of its conceptual framework, and highlight some rather curious design quirks that have, well, persisted for decades.
Exactly. And this isn't just about, one specific scale. It's about something far more fundamental, really. It's about how we attempt to quantify subjective human experiences, the hidden complexities behind what just looks like a simple line on a page, and ultimately what that means for how we interpret health data. Whether you're just curious about your own well-being or maybe involved in broader research, the insights here reveal just how much goes into those seemingly simple numbers.
Okay, all right, let's pull back for a moment then and look at the bigger picture first. Before we dive deep into the EQ VAS specifically, what exactly is a visual analog scale, or VAS in general?
Right. So at its core, a visual analog scale is basically a class of measurement tools. They're designed to capture subjective assessments of personal experiences. Just picture a straight line, usually with clearly labeled endpoints. These define the boundaries of whatever experience you're interested in measuring. So, for example, no pain at one end.
And worst pain imaginable at the other, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Or maybe best possible mood to worst possible mood.
And the clever part is how it works, right? You, the participant, you just mark a point on that line that best represents how you're feeling or your experience. Then, someone measures the distance from an endpoint, and that gives you a numerical value. The whole goal here, I gather, is to get what scientists call an interval scale.
That's the ideal, yes.
Like a ruler, sort of.
Yeah.
So the distance between, say, a 20 and a 30 is meant to be exactly the same amount of difference as between a 70 and an 80.
Exactly. That's the assumption.
Because if your health scale isn't truly interval, then saying someone improved from 20 to 30 might not mean the same amount of improvement as someone going from 70 to 80. That could really skew our understanding of changes, couldn't it?
It absolutely could. It's a crucial point. And these scales, they actually have a really broad history. They trace their origins way back to the field of psychophysics.
Psychophysics, what's that?
It's basically the study of how physical stimuli, like light or sound intensity, relate to our psychological experiences of them. Researchers like Hayes and Patterson are often credited for some of the earliest uses back then. And from there, the whole VAS concept just exploded. It started appearing in consumer satisfaction surveys, political polling, and then by the 1960s, they became really widespread for assessing symptom severity. Things like pain, mood, depression, anxiety, even stuff like alertness.
Okay, so that's the general VAS. Now let's zero in on the EQ VAS specifically. What sets it apart?
Okay, so the EQ VAS is a crucial component of the widely used EQ 5D health status measure. When you complete it, you're asked to rate your health today on a vertical sort of thermometer-like scale. This scale runs from 0, which is labeled worst health you can imagine, all the way up to 100, signifying best health you can imagine. What's particularly noteworthy, I think, is that it's considered a patient-reported outcome, or PRO.
Excellent.
Yeah, and this means the numerical rating you give is reported directly by you, the respondent. There's no external scoring or weighting system fiddling with it. It's meant to be your raw self-assessment of your health right now.
And it's not some obscure research tool tucked away in a lab somewhere, is it? I feel like I've seen these.
Oh, far from it. It's incredibly well established. It's used globally for measuring and comparing health across massive general populations. It's in clinical trials for new medications and within specific disease groups. It provides a standardized way, although maybe, as we'll see, a sometimes mysterious way to get a snapshot of how people perceive their own health.
Right, here's where it gets really interesting. And honestly, it's a bit of a bombshell, I think. You might assume, logically, that a tool used this widely with such a specific design was meticulously crafted for its current purpose from day one, right? Well, prepare for a fascinating revelation. Despite its current widespread use for self-reported health, the EQ VAS wasn't even designed for that intention at all. Its current primary use was actually an accidental discovery, kind of an off-label success story.
That's the really surprising twist. The EuroQol Group, which formed back in 1987, set out with this really ambitious goal: develop a generic instrument to describe health and also to value health, which of course led eventually to the EQ 5D system. And they chose the visual analog scale as their preferred method for the valuation part, meaning assigning a numerical value to a hypothetical health state someone might be in.
Okay, so valuing hypothetical states, not your own health.
Exactly. Brooks, one of the early members, noted it was chosen for its relative simplicity for scaling and quick way of getting valuations. They needed something practical for large surveys. But here's the crucial, almost ironic point. The EQ VAS, as we know it now, asking about your own health, was initially designed purely as a warm-up task for respondents.
A warm-up task? You're kidding.
No, seriously, it was just meant to familiarize people with the tool before they went on to value those hypothetical health states. Imagine being asked to draw a line from descriptions of someone else's imagined health condition, like moderate pain, some mobility issues, to a position on the VAS. That was its original job. So the own health rating component, where you rate your health today, that was actually used off-label as a standalone instrument in clinical studies for quite a while before it was formally endorsed by the group. It wasn't until 1994 that this own health rating bit officially became known as the EQ VAS as an independent questionnaire. Quite a journey from a simple preparatory exercise.
That's truly remarkable. So the EuroQol Group had this grand vision for valuing health states, and then, almost by chance, one of their little warm-up exercises starts to take on a life of its own and becomes this central measurement tool.
Yeah.
And the design itself, it went through some changes too, right, to get to the version we recognize today.
Yes, exactly. There were early empirical studies. People like Sintinen and the team at York, they extensively tested different VAS presentations. They looked at vertical versus horizontal orientations, different labels, stuff like that. And they found that the vertical scales with numerical labels and those little hash marks, much like a thermometer, were generally preferred for that original valuation task.
Right, the valuation task, not necessarily self-rating.
Correct. And so by 1990, the final format was essentially fixed. That 20-centimeter vertical line, numerical indicators every 10 points, tiny hash marks at each millimeter.
With best imaginable health at 100 up top and worst imaginable health at 0 down below. The classic feeling thermometer, or EuroQol VAS.
That's the one.
And then you mentioned a revision in 2009.
Yes, a significant one. They changed it from physically drawing a line connecting the description to the scale to simply writing your number directly into a box next to the scale. They also improved the text instructions to clear up some reporting issues people were having. But what's truly fascinating here, and the review paper really hammers this home, is that the specific design elements of the EQ VAS, like its vertical orientation, the fact you used to draw a line, the very choice of best imaginable and worst imaginable as the end labels, these were not chosen with the primary purpose of measuring your own self-reported overall health.
They were chosen for the warm-up.
Exactly. They were chosen because they suited the original role as a valuation warm-up, and yet, almost serendipitously, it proved to be a valid and pretty effective measure of self-reported health status anyway. It's a bit like finding out your favorite coffee mug was originally designed as, I don't know, a pencil holder. It works great for coffee, but you're left scratching your head about some of those design choices.
Huh. That's a great analogy. So, okay, we've got this tool, this warm-up exercise that became an accidental superstar. But if its design wasn't even intended for its main gig now, that leaves us with a really critical, almost elusive question. What is the EQ VAS truly measuring when you rate your own health? Is there a risk that we're essentially flying blind with this incredibly widely used tool?
That's a surprising truth, really. Despite its widespread use for decades, there's a striking dearth of literature, a real lack of research, directly addressing the conceptual framework of the EQ VAS, specifically as a measure of self-rated general health.
So we don't fully know what people are thinking when they mark that line.
We have some clues, but it's surprisingly murky. We get some insights from qualitative studies where researchers actually talk to people about how they use the scale. Imagine asking, say, 100 people what best imaginable health truly means to them. You'd probably expect some consistency, right?
Yeah, we would, yeah.
But studies like one by Tan and colleagues looking at Asian populations reveal a fascinating kind of chaos. People interpret it wildly differently. For some, it's peak physical fitness. For others, it's deep mental peace or strong social relationships, or even just having good knowledge about health promotion. Some participants even felt that best imaginable health was simply an impossible ideal, something unachievable.
Wow.
And similarly, worst imaginable health was variously interpreted as death or specific diseases or disability. It wasn't uniform. Another study by Ernst and colleagues, this time involving patients with type 1 diabetes, found that respondents often struggled to define or even properly imagine best imaginable health. They frequently just used it as a kind of vague reference point to compare their own current health against.
So it wasn't even a clear anchor point for them.
Not always, no. Which raises this crucial, almost philosophical question. Do people truly have a shared, consistent understanding of what those extreme endpoints, best imaginable health and worst imaginable health, actually mean? Because if everyone's imagining something fundamentally different when they see those labels, how can we truly compare their scores, especially across different cultures or groups?
That's a profound point. It really makes you think. And yet, on the empirical side, the practical side, we know that various factors, social demographic things like age, education, income, economic factors, behavioral things like exercise, drinking habits, health conditions, even environmental factors. These have all consistently been shown to impact EQ VAS scores. So it's clearly picking up something meaningful related to health, even if its conceptual underpinnings are, well, murky.
Indeed. And when researchers talk about psychometric properties, they're basically asking, does this tool actually measure what it claims to? That's validity. And does it give us consistent results if we use it multiple times? That's reliability. Now, for the EQ VAS, studies generally demonstrate satisfactory to strong validity. That means it largely seems to measure the theoretical idea of overall health that it's designed to capture, and this holds across various disease groups.
Okay, so it does work in that sense.
Mostly, yes. However, interestingly, this validity isn't found quite as consistently in Asian populations, which might potentially link back to that greater variability in interpretation that Tan and colleagues observed in their qualitative work.
Right, if people understand the scale differently.
Exactly, but critically, its performance in test-retest reliability, getting consistent results if someone takes it, say, a week apart without any real health change, and its responsiveness, its ability to detect meaningful change over time when someone's health does improve or decline, that's been found to be less satisfactory in some studies.
So it's valid, but maybe not always reliable or sensitive to change.
That's one interpretation. And one theory to explain its continued utility, despite these potential issues and its surprising origin story, is that the EQ VAS might be capturing dimensions of health beyond just the 5 specific dimensions described by the other part of the EQ 5D, the descriptive system part.
Ah, okay. So it might be picking up other aspects of well-being.
Potentially, yes. Things that aren't covered by mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain, discomfort, and anxiety, depression. But that's still a bit of an open question.
Okay, let's zoom in on some of those specific design elements of the EQ VAS that researchers are still questioning even today. It sounds like some of these historical quirks might actually hinder its performance in some ways.
They might indeed. Let's start with the endpoint descriptors themselves. Best imaginable health and worst imaginable health. It's interesting, as far back as 1923, a real pioneer in reading scales named Freyd cautioned against using extreme language like that for endpoints. He thought it could distort responses.
1923.
Yeah, and as those qualitative studies we just discussed showed, these labels are genuinely difficult for many respondents to imagine or relate to personally. Best imaginable health is sometimes even considered unachievable, like a fantasy. And this difficulty often leads to what's called endpoint aversion bias.
Endpoint aversion, meaning people just avoid the ends.
Exactly. People simply avoid marking the extreme ends of the scale, 0 or 100, even if their health is conceptually very good or very bad. And this bias might actually explain something puzzling. Why respondents who report having absolutely no problems on the EQ5D descriptive system still often don't give a full score of 100 on the EQ VAS.
Oh, interesting. So it's not necessarily that the VAS is covering more aspects of health in those cases.
It could simply be that people are shying away from those extreme, hard-to-imagine labels at the very top. Furthermore, using best imaginable health and worst imaginable health on a single continuum creates what's called a bipolar design. You've got 2 different concepts applied to one scale.
Bipolar, okay.
And some researchers, like Weirs and Lowe's, have cautioned that these bipolar designs can be less effective than unipolar ones, which apply only one concept to the continuum, like your no pain to extreme pain example. And remember that Ernst study. They even found some respondents were less attentive to the worst imaginable health endpoint than the best imaginable health one.
Yeah.
So it's like having a scale where one end just doesn't grab people's attention as much or feels less relevant.
So even the labels themselves are potentially problematic, or at least a bit of a dilemma. What about those little hash marks? The small lines indicating all the integers from 0 to 100. They seem practical, right? Letting you quickly pick a specific number.
They do seem practical, and they were almost certainly included for that very reason, to make it easier for users and researchers to ascertain a clear numerical value without needing a ruler to measure the line. However, going back again to Freud in 1923, he actually advised against using breaks and division lines in rating scales like that. He thought it might interrupt the continuous judgment process.
So even the little lines weren't universally loved.
Apparently not. And interestingly, Tan et al.'s qualitative study, the one in Asian populations, found some respondents actually felt the hash marks on the EQ VAS were too granular, too detailed. They suggested removing them might even make the scale easier to understand or use, though importantly, that specific finding hasn't really been generalized to all populations. It's an interesting tension between practicality and potential cognitive overload or artificial precision.
It's clear there are some really fascinating unresolved questions hanging over this scale about its conceptual framework and these design quirks. Yet, despite being the sort of accidental superstar with lingering questions, the EQ VAS has been a constant feature of the EQ 5D instruments for over 30 years now. It's generated literally thousands upon thousands of observations and massive datasets worldwide.
Absolutely. And the review paper we're discussing really highlights what remains the persistent, almost elusive question: what does the EQ VAS measure? It concludes, unsurprisingly perhaps, that more research is definitely warranted into its design, its conceptual framework, and how it actually functions empirically in different contexts. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, there's a really critical balance to consider here. While improvements might seem desirable, changing a long-standing instrument like the EQ VAS has significant implications.
Right, because you lose comparability.
Precisely. Its consistency and standardization over time have actually been a major strength. It provides a valuable historic reference for comparing health outcomes across diverse conditions, across different countries, across different clinical trials over decades. So any potential gains from tweaking the design now must be carefully weighed against its likely losses in terms of that historical comparability. You don't want to suddenly break the ability to look back and compare today's results with data from 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's a really tricky trade-off. Improving a tool versus maintaining the integrity and usefulness of decades of accumulated data. Looking ahead then, what about the future of the EQ VAS, especially in our increasingly digital world? Because so much data collection is moving online now.
That's a huge area of development and, frankly, another area with some uncertainty. Digital versions of the EQ VAS currently vary quite widely. Some use sliding scales on a screen, others might have fewer hash marks, or even no hash marks at all compared to the traditional paper version.
So they're not all the same.
Not necessarily, no. And the impact of these differences on the actual measurement, and crucially, whether these digital versions are truly equivalent to the paper format they're replacing, that's still somewhat uncertain. The EuroQol Group itself is actively working on harmonizing these digital EQ VAS versions, trying to establish standards, but it's a massive undertaking. Interestingly, though, stepping outside of the EQ VAS specifically for a moment, other evidence suggests that modern electronic survey platforms can actually be beneficial for VAS-type scales in general. Some studies show electronic versions can have superior measurement properties compared to other common reading scales, like those standard Likert-type scales. Strongly agree, but strongly disagree.
Oh, so the digital format itself might actually improve things in some ways.
It's possible, yes. Better precision, maybe easier completion for some users. It's an active area of research. And this actually brings us to a really powerful parallel, something worth thinking about. The concept of self-rated health, or SRH.
SRH, okay, what's that?
It's usually a conceptually similar single-item measure. It simply asks people for an overall assessment of their health, often using a really simple scale, like asking, in general, would you say your health is excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor?
I've definitely seen questions like that.
Right? And what's truly remarkable about SRH is that for the past half century or so, study after study has shown it to be one of the strongest predictors of mortality and morbidity. That's death and illness across incredibly diverse populations worldwide. It often predicts these outcomes even after accounting for a whole myriad of other known risk factors, like age, smoking, existing medical conditions. It's shockingly powerful for such a simple question.
Wow, just asking someone how their health is.
Seems too simple, but it works. And what's fascinating is if the EQ VAS conceptually captures a similar phenomenon to SRH, that kind of holistic overall self-assessment of well-being, then it potentially can be as powerful a measure of health as SRH is proven to be.
That makes sense. Does it predict mortality like SRH does?
Well, that's the thing. We've actually only found one published paper so far that specifically explores the EQ VAS's ability to predict mortality. So this suggests there's a real need for much more research here. We need to see if the robust theoretical frameworks that have been developed over decades to explain why SRH works so well can perhaps be applied to the EQ VAS too, and if we can truly unlock its full predictive power.
What a fascinating journey we've taken today. We've seen how the EQ VAS, this tool you might easily encounter in a doctor's office or a research study, has had this really unexpected history. From basically being a simple warm-up exercise for valuing hypothetical scenarios to becoming this broadly accepted, almost ubiquitous measure of self-assessed health. And all of this while still grappling with these fundamental questions about its true meaning and whether its original design is actually optimal for what we use it for now.
Absolutely. Its proven validity in many contexts is certainly clear. We shouldn't dismiss that. But its full potential and the nuances of its design and what it truly captures, those things still warrant much deeper investigation. It's undoubtedly a powerful measure, but it's one that continues to evolve and reveal its hidden depths, much like our own understanding of health itself, I suppose.
So next time you're asked to rate your health on one of those vertical scales, maybe just take a second to consider the rich, unexpected history and the ongoing questions behind that simple line. What stands out to you at how we attempt, and sometimes struggle, to quantify something as profoundly personal as our overall well-being?